In today's narrative reading, some of the repetitive diction has been condensed for clarity. So now hear this story from the 3rd chapter of the book of Daniel, omitting verses 2 through 6. King Nebuchadnezzar made a golden statue whose height was 60 cubits and whose width was 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon, so that all officials and leaders assembled for the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent for the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to assemble and come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. So all the officials and leaders assembled before the statue, and the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and the entire musical ensemble, you are to fall down and worship this golden statue. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire." Therefore, as soon as they heard the instruments, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Accordingly, at this time, certain Chaldeans came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the musical instruments shall fall down and worship the golden statue, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. There are 3 certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These pay no heed to you, O king. They do not serve your gods, and they do not worship the golden statue that you've set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought in. So they brought those men before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, and you do not worship the golden statue that I've set up? Now, if you are ready when you hear the sound of the instruments to fall down and worship the statue that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor will we worship the golden statue that you have set up." Nebuchadnezzar was so filled with rage against them that his face was distorted. He ordered the furnace to be heated up 7 times more than was customary, and ordered some of the strongest guards in his army to bind them and to throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So the men were bound, still wearing tunics and trousers, their hats and their other garments, and they were thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Because the king's command was urgent and the furnace was so overheated, the raging flames killed the men who lifted the 3. But the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound, into the furnace of blazing fire. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose up quickly. He said to his counselors, "Was it not 3 men that we threw into the fire?" And they answered, "True, O king." He replied, "But I see 4, unbound, walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the 4th has the appearance of a god." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here." So they came out from the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and king's counselors gathered together, and they saw that the fire had no power over these bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed. Their tunics were not harmed, and not even the smell of the fire came from them. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent an angel and delivered these servants who trusted. They disobeyed the king's commands and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of these 3 shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." Then the king promoted them in the province of Babylon. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
I think it's possible I might be one of the few fans of the Beastie Boys in this august gathering of people, but they have a song, and I keep hearing Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and the Beastie Boys. Anyways, thank you, Victor. Last week, we heard a story about how King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream about a great statue. Remember that? It was, and I quote, "huge, its brilliance extraordinary." And then the statue was broken into pieces, which is an allegory about how kingdoms may seem ever powerful and endless, but in fact will fall. So that was last chapter. In that moment, King Nebuchadnezzar seemed to appreciate Daniel's interpretation of the dream, but I warned you it wouldn't stick in his head for long. So here we are, the next chapter, and he has made a golden statue whose height was 60 cubits and whose width was 6 cubits. And if my biblical math is correct, that's about 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, which, in addition to his hubris, reveals that it is also not a hallmark of strong engineering. It does not have a base wide enough to support its height. As I mentioned in the introduction to worship, Herodotus and other contemporary writers spoke of kings building giant statues like this. So even if the story of Daniel is more of a fable than a historical account, we know that ancient rulers did build such statues, and so we can imagine someone like Nebuchadnezzar building this big monument to their own ego. And King Nebuchadnezzar intended everyone to bow down before his statue. It was a big deal. He sent for the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces, all of them to assemble, to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up, all of them. And then he assembled the best praise band any church has ever seen, with the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the drum, and the entire musical ensemble. Who wouldn't want to worship at that church? I mean, that idol. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are faced with a dilemma. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were Daniel's companions, exiled from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, and they were Jerusalem youths of privilege, educated to serve this foreign king. It's interesting, we refer to Daniel by his Hebrew name and not Belteshazzar, as the palace master renamed him. But we forget Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were first Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And even literary characters in a book know the first commandment of Judaism is, "You shall have no other gods before me." You cannot be an observant Jew, even one living in exile, and bow down before a 90-foot tall gold statue that Nebuchadnezzar puts up in the town square. You just can't. But many people go along with this plan. They show up, they bow down, and some Chaldeans notice that the 3 Jewish guys aren't there. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego aren't trying to cause a fuss. They are not out there to topple this statue that's going to fall over on its own merits before long. They just aren't there to worship it. And perhaps they maybe don't want to be in its shadow in case it falls. Because idols, when they fall, cause a lot of damage. I don't know how you've felt in recent years about the news accounts of powerful men who have lost their jobs as stories of sexual abuse and harassment and other misconduct have come to light. The men accused have worked in news and TV and comedy and politics and Hollywood and sports and the church. Some men have lost their jobs, others remain in power and call their victims liars. And the political parties may respond to the news differently, but men on both sides of the aisle stand accused, facing credible allegations. The thing that all of these allegations and situations have in common is power. People in power, in these situations, all men, abusing their power over people who are dependent on them for employment and for career advancement. It's about power. What people will do for power and with power once it's in their grasp. Nebuchadnezzar built himself a really big statue. What he needed, instead of Chaldeans pointing out who wasn't in the forced crowd worshiping with the big praise band, he needed advisors to help him dial back his ego so he could use his power for better ends. "Sir, may you live forever. This statue will be prohibitively expensive, and you will have to tax the people. Perhaps, O mighty king, if you use the money to feed the people, they would worship you spontaneously without being forced to do so." Or one of them could have said, "Most Royal Highness, I've been looking at the blueprints for this statue and I have some concerns. If you want it to stand forever, might I suggest a few changes that might help it not topple onto the crowd of people who are trying to worship you?" Or, "O king, your greatness won't be known from these acts of worship, but for your care for your subjects. Let's build a stronger society instead of building statues." Where were those voices for Nebuchadnezzar? These men in our news feeds may now have fallen from their power, but where were the voices in their lives calling them to higher goals and values? Where were their friends, the ones who were more interested in their wholeness than in how their fame was going to trickle down and benefit them? We get seduced by proximity to power. We saw that in last week's story when the temple authorities buddied up to the Seleucid invaders, and it was great and all until the invaders desecrated and demolished the temple and burned the Bible. We see it today as politicians and voters and churches clamor to be on the side of a candidate who promises riches and glory. And anyone who tries to sell you a Bible they are marketing so they can charge you for an autograph is not doing it because they love Jesus. They're just not. So while I'm praying for former President Trump's health and safety, as we mentioned in the introduction to worship, I remain appalled that somebody of such little integrity is a leading candidate for higher office. I'm at the same time sad for him. Where are the people in his circle speaking truth? Where are his loved ones and his trusted advisors helping him be his better version of himself? It has to be lonely to be surrounded by people who won't call you on your lies and your missteps and your deceptions. Where is the meaning in life when the people who supposedly love you let you continue to be deceitful? I pray that some of that is set aside in these days as he recovers from his injuries yesterday, that he can heal by actual support. And this failure of advisors happens on both sides of the aisle. And no matter what you think about whether a candidate is too old to serve as president, it matters that people ask the question. And every time I will choose the candidate with integrity who has people around them allowed to ask difficult questions. One of the things I'm grateful for in the Presbyterian Church and here at Calvary is that we have built divisions of power into our structures. So I take my ideas to the session, our elected leaders of the congregation, and sometimes they agree with me, and sometimes they tell me I'm wrong. And sure, it can lead to uncomfortable moments sometimes, but I hope we see that the alternative to that is idolatry and crumbling statues. I think that's why recent decisions of the Supreme Court are so alarming to us. We worry about the checks and balances that were built into our system to keep a president from becoming Nebuchadnezzar are being dismantled. We have to trust that the faithful way is to be able to speak uncomfortable truths to each other and not just surround ourselves with people who will give us the answers we want. Should we be surprised when Nebuchadnezzars lose their way and when idols fall? We think we know who they are because we see a version of them on screen and in the news or over the radio. And so when the news breaks, we feel betrayed, disappointed for sure. We thought we knew them. We didn't know them. Two of my favorite musicians who provided the soundtrack for much of my earlier life were Van Morrison and Eric Clapton. And after COVID, they revealed to the world that they believed vaccines were propaganda and that COVID wasn't a risk. I cannot listen to their music with the same joy I used to. I did not know them. We build our idols up to be 90 feet tall, covered in gold, but only 6 cubits wide. An idol like that isn't meant to stay standing. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego never bothered to get attached to the idol. They didn't bother to even admire the gold or the workmanship. They weren't seduced by the fact that all the important people were there to worship. I mean, the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces. I mean, they were all there. That's a chance for a selfie, right, with a famous person. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't get caught up in that idol worship. They managed not to succumb to the lure of power that goes with fame and idols. They see the golden statue for what it is, a vain plea for validation from a narcissist. They hear the big praise band for what it is too, a noise to cover the silence where we hear our insecurities. What is that compared to worshiping the God who created the universe and put the stars in their courses and made humanity in the divine image? Nebuchadnezzar cannot abide to the indifference to his schemes. His very success is built on everyone gathering for the spectacle and reading his tweets and filling the world with noise and worshiping an item of his creation. So what would happen if the other people started behaving as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, unimpressed with those shallow displays of ego and power? What if the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces all went back to work and went about their business without bowing down to Nebuchadnezzar's golden feet? What if they stopped reading his tweets and stopped giving him a microphone? What if the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble stopped playing and people were left with the vacuous silence of his empty promises? There's a whole system at risk here, and so our 3 friends are thrown into a furnace. One of my friends commented on this text, wondering if she would have the courage to die for her faith. And that is certainly a risk for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as they were thrown into the flames. Dying is always an option, whether we're in a furnace or not. We are fragile human beings who die in car crashes or from cancer, from gun violence, or if we're lucky, asleep in our beds of old age. Dying is always on the table for humanity. But I wonder if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego call us to ask a different question. Do we have the courage to live for our faith? When they are called before Nebuchadnezzar, they reply with, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace and out of your hand, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue you have set up. They don't have guarantees of their deliverance. Dying is always on the table for humanity. But they have hope. They lay out the conditions by which they want to live their lives. They will not worship the idol. They will continue to serve their God, the God of exiles in a foreign land. They choose to live by placing their hope in God and not in human idols or power. There are many idols today for us to worship. To some degree, at some point or other, I'm sure we all fall prey to their shiny promises for a time. But then we remember that even God in Jesus chose to have courage to live for his faith by living a human life where death was always an option. The idols around us will always fall because they're not built to stand. The God we serve is not a human-built idol made of gold. God in Jesus is a divinely born human who chose to walk next to us in humility, aware of his vulnerability. Jesus did not grab hold of power when it was offered to him. He was not swayed or impressed by the men who held power of earthly rule, and by not being afraid to die, he showed us how to live. He is our hope, and it is with hope that we prepare to live our lives with faith. I have a friend and a seminary classmate whose brother Hunter died of AIDS 27 years ago this week. And so she shared a letter he had written shortly before his death to someone else who had HIV. And Hunter knew he was going to die, and he said it changed how he lived. He wrote, "Whereas many people live their lives as though they will live forever, putting off in some remote, unforeseeable future the important moments they are drawn to, moments of particular significance, such as the long-awaited vacation, the 10th anniversary, being made partner in your firm, or some sort of hoped-for future event. In other words, they live in an idealized future, combined with an embellished or edited past. They leave a tiny corner of their lives for the present, and they don't see the potential of the moment they're in, the potential to come into contact with and to touch the lives of the people they encounter, whether co-workers or cashiers, whatever service personnel, or even telephone solicitors. Things can be irritating," he wrote, "but irritating things can be turned around." He continues, "I told someone I feel like a tourist all the time, even in my own city. I notice everything now as though it is new, even landscapes I pass daily. I notice trees that have been pruned. I notice that someone has discarded underwear on the street. The creek has risen and altered the sandbar. I notice a particular drainage structure is stopped up and creating an artificial pond with its floating litter." I never got to know my friend's brother Hunter, but I love his sister, and so I'm thankful for his words, for his reminder for us to see the potential for hope in our living, even as we know we are dying. With the news lately, it's easy to question if hope is the right feeling to have. But the grief for the brokenness of the world does not erase our hope. As Rebecca Solnit wrote about the news, "It's too soon for despair, though not too soon for grief. Grief and hope can coexist. Grief for who and what has already been harmed, and hope for preventing more harm." Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego also knew of despair and grief. They'd been exiled to a foreign land, their home in ruins, called by names other than their own, and they still had hope. As Emily Dickinson describes it, that thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without words and never stops at all. Their hope gave them courage to live for their faith. May it be so for us. Amen.
Amen.